We've got what is probably the most honourable chivalric order faction in our next faction pack review, or at least they think they are, and it is of course the time of the Flesh Eater Courts, which is actually another death army and is actually the newest in terms of a range refresh for the death factions, and I believe one of the newest apart from Skaven and obviously the Stormcast Eternals with their new 4th edition models from the starter set. They are one of the very newest factions in the game, getting their update right at the tail end of 3rd edition. So they do have a load of gorgeous new models going into 4th. And of course, coming into the new edition, they did get some updated rules, although their mechanics have, to a quite significant extent, stayed familiar from what they were in their latest Battle Tome, which came in, as I said, at the end of 3rd edition. So let's take a look at their new rules and mechanics and systems and see how they all work together. The battle traits for the Flesh Eater Courts are the noble deeds that we saw back in 3rd edition, with the ability to generate up to 6 noble deed points for your heroes whenever they chant or cast a spell successfully, and also when they do damage in combat. So if they fight into an enemy and do 4 points of damage, then that will generate them 4 noble deed points after the fight ability has been resolved. So it can be reasonably easy for you to get up to the cap of 6 for them, especially since a lot of your heroes, even the fighty ones, are either priests or wizards, so you can get those points from chanting and casting, and then also fighting as well. So it is quite possible to get up to that 6 cap in a single turn if you're lucky. And then with those points, you can do a few things. Feeding Frenzy is your battle trait passive, and what that means is that when a friendly unit is wholly within 12 inches of a hero that's got 6 noble deed points, they get +1 attacks to their weapons, including companion weapons. So even things like your dragons and your terrorgeists will get a benefit from this, and they can get a load of extra attacks on all their various weapons. You can also instead choose to spend the noble deed points rather than keep them. So if you do this, you will lose that Feeding Frenzy buff, but they can be used instead to bring some of your units and some of your models back. So Muster Guard lets you in your movement phase spend 1 or more points to bring back a model to a unit wholly within 12 inches. So 1 point gets you a Serf back, which is things like your basic ghouls, whilst 2 points, if you spend those, that gets you a Knight back, which is your bigger things like your Flayers and your Morbeg Knights. So it is just a nice, reliable way to get up to 6 models back into a unit that has been damaged earlier in the game. And then you can also choose to do a sort of bigger version of this with Summon Loyal Subjects. This can only be done by your abhorrent heroes, so your actual like Ghoul Kings and the like. The Muster Guard ability can be done by your sort of lesser heroes, what are called your courtiers. They can do that one. This bigger, better one is done by your sort of top tier heroes. And they can again, in the movement phase, choose to do this, but they have to spend all 6 of their noble deed points. And they can again pick a unit of serfs or knights that has been destroyed, and they can set up a replacement unit with half the models in it, 9 inches away from enemies, and 6 inches from a battlefield edge. So while the courtiers can bring back sort of a few models here and there into existing units, your bigger heroes, your abhorrents, can actually bring sort of bigger full units back, or at least half strength units back onto the board. So you could just fully bring back 20 ghouls from a 40 strong blob back onto the board, ready to take the enemy on again. So it's a brilliant way to, yes, you give up some of the extra fighty ability from Feeding Frenzy, but it's a great way to get loads more value from your units than the War Scrolls might indicate. The final part of your traits is the Royal Blood rule, which is a very simple self-heal. You can do it in your hero phase and you pick any number of your abhorrent models and they each heal D3. So it's just a nice little way to keep your bigger heroes sticking around that little bit longer so they can keep bringing those buffs to the rest of your army. The formations you have access to also play into the idea of the noble deeds and also your ability to return models. The one we saw from the preview is Ghoul Patrol, which turns your ghouls essentially into Lumineth. You get to pick 2 units to fight before the enemy chooses one, when you are fighting with your crypt ghouls. So you could, in theory, get up to 80 ghouls attacking before the enemy gets to choose a unit. So they can do potentially a lot of work. And I think if you are running a list heavy in crypt ghouls, this could be a great formation to consider. It is a shame it's only crypt ghouls, so this doesn't work on all surf units. It doesn't go off on things like crypt guard, but it is not a bad formation just in itself. Again, if you are going in heavy with the crypt ghouls. The Cannibal Court formation lets you use the Hunger for Glory ability. This is done at the end of any turn, and you give a noble deed point to each hero of yours that is outside friendly territory. So if you are being aggressive and moving up to take the fight to the enemy, this could just make sure you are topped off with those noble deed points. I would say this one could be a bit situational perhaps, because some of the deployment maps do have very big territories for you to get out of, and on top of that, a lot of your melee heroes anyway will be able to get up to that 6 cap without a huge amount of difficulty. So this could maybe not have a use all the time, but it will be a nice backup just to make sure you do always have that supply of noble deed points when you do need it. Raise the Banners is the ability for the Lords of the Manor. I really like this one. It is incredibly strong. It's a passive that means whenever a friendly unit brings a slain model back, you add 1 to the number of models returned. So whenever you muster guard and spend 6 points to get ghouls back, you will actually get 7 back instead. And also, if you spend 2 points to say get 1 Morbeg Knight back, you would actually get 2. So that is a big return on your investment. And I also really like this one because it also works on things like rally as well. So you can get more models back from your rally command on your units. So there is a lot of ways to get a couple of extra models back across your army each turn. And I think this can really help you get a lot more value from your points, thanks to the good recursion mechanics that Flesh Eater Courts have. The final one is the Royal Menagerie, which is your monster focus formation. This one lets you once per turn in your combat phase pick a friendly monster and you can roll a dice. And on a 3+, they get strike first for the turn. Now, this is only in your combat phase, so this could be useful or it could be not at all. If you've charged in, then it is less likely you're going to need strike first unless you've charged in multiple things and you want to get a couple of activations off before the enemy. So I mean, it's not bad, but I just think that it being one monster you can choose in your combat phase and only going off on a 3+, it does potentially make this one a bit more restrictive than the other ones. To me, the Lords of the Manor is the clear winner, with Ghoul Patrol also being really quite good, and then Cannibal Court and the Royal Menagerie, yes, definitely having their uses, but maybe being a bit more situational. So if you want to use them, you really do have to have a plan in mind and build your army up around making the most of them. In terms of your traits and artifacts, I do think they're quite good overall. A couple are a bit iffy, but they do all have some potential. Cruel Taskmaster lets you roll 3 extra dice when you use the rally command on a unit wholly within 12 inches of the bearer. This is of course really nice just for making sure you get a couple of extra models back and really will help you keep your units at almost full strength for as long as possible, especially when you consider this does work in conjunction with the Raise the Banners formation. Stronger in Madness plays into your noble deed points. Your hero gets 2 extra health, which is just a strong flat buff anyway, but on top of that, when you have 6 noble deed points, you also get a 5-up ward. So this is possibly going to be good on a hero that you want to keep with those 6 noble deed points to be your sort of feeding friendly caddy to spread that aura around. And then finally, the Savage Beyond Reason trait is another nice little dual effect one. When you have less than 6 noble deed points, you get the crit 2 hits rule. When you do have the full 6 points, you instead get the crit mortals rule. So either way, you're getting a fairly nice buff on your melee, and I think this is going to help when you are either going into bigger units of chaff or going into more heavily armored infantry when you get the crit mortal rule. So as I said, I do think they all have their uses, and I like how they play into the noble deed points system and also into your formations. And genuinely, I could see any one of them being taken on a tougher, fightier hero just to get the absolute most out of them. The artifacts are a little iffier in my opinion. The Charnel Vestments gives you the Priest 1 rule to a hero, or lets you add 1 to your chanting rolls if they already were a priest, which is okay. The Flesh Eater Courts do have some decent prayers, but it does say if you take this and you are a wizard, you can't chant and cast. So on some heroes, I think this will make them just feel a little bit more restricted than anything else. The Grim Garland reduces enemy control by 2 when they're within 12 inches of your hero, which is nice. It can again help you flip an objective or 2 from your opponent, but isn't anything super exciting. And then finally, the Heart of the Gargant is your once per battle artifact. You use this and you add +1 attacks to your hero and also their companion weapons. This is obviously really good on something like a Ghoul King, on a dragon or a Terrorgeist, and it can make them really quite scary in melee. But it is again once per battle, so it can be relatively limiting in how much it can actually impact the game overall. But if you've got Feeding Frenzy up and you get the extra attack on top of that, you could very well swing a really important combat with this artifact. So it could be very useful if you know where you are going to be sending your dragon or Terrorgeist to get the absolute most from it. Having both priests and wizards, the Flesh Eater Courts do get a spell, a manifestation, and a prayer lore, which is quite exciting. We will, as ever, cover the manifestations later on in the video, but the spell lore is the Law of Madness, and it nets you 3 relatively easy to cast spells. Deranged Transformation is cast on a 6 and lets you pick an infantry or a cavalry unit wholly within 12 inches, and they get +2 inches to their movement and also +1 to wound until your next turn. So this is really good. It makes even your slower units move a solid 8 inches most of the time. And then the bonus to wound, especially with the weight of dice your army can throw out, makes you much scarier into your opponent. The Miasma of Madness is an easy 5+ to cast. This one lets you pick an enemy unit within 18 inches, and then you can roll 7 dice, and various effects happen based on the roll. So if 2 or more of the dice are the same, the enemy unit takes 1 mortal damage. If 3 or more of the dice are the same, they take the mortal damage and also get -1 to their hit rolls for the turn. If 4 or more of the dice are the same, they get all that and also -1 to their wound rolls. So you can potentially make an enemy unit -1 to hit, -1 to wound, and take a mortal damage, which is very nice. Now, with rolling 7 dice, you are guaranteed to get 2 duplicates, but getting 3 is also reasonably likely. It's 4 where you start to get sort of like that's probably not going to happen. But getting 2 is guaranteed, getting 3 is quite likely. So most of the time you can guess that this is going to do 1 mortal damage and make an enemy unit -1 to hit. So that's not bad, but the main downside is that it is very random. You could quite easily just get 1 mortal damage on the enemy, which isn't great for a whole spell cast. It's nice if it goes your way, and as I said, on average rolling, you probably should get 1 mortal damage and -1 to hit. I just don't like the overall randomness of it, but if you do need to debuff an enemy Death Star, this is a good way to at least try and do that. The third and also great spell is Charnel Feast. This is cast on a 6+ and it's got an 18-inch range and targets an enemy unit. You do D3 mortal damage to them, and then you pick a friendly infantry unit within 6 inches of that target, and they can return a slain model for each point of damage. So if you did 3 damage to the enemy on the D3, you could get 3 models back in that unit. So it's nice to do a little bit of chip damage, and also give some healing back to you, which is really handy, and also being cast on a 6+ isn't that difficult to get off either. Your prayers are the Rites of Delusion, and they all have a decent chant value of 5. Blessed Feast is your unlimited prayer, which lets you pick an enemy unit within 18 inches, and whenever a model in the target unit is slain, until your next turn, you can heal 1 to a friendly unit that is in combat with that enemy, and if you chanted it on a 10+, they heal D3 instead. So this is really good for keeping bigger things like your knights sticking around in combat much more reliably and avoiding any sort of small chip damage that keeps coming their way. The Summer King's Favour is chanted on a friendly hero wholly within 18 inches of the priest, and this grants them a bonus deed point whenever they kill an enemy model in combat. If instead you chant it on a 10, then that point is given to all friendly heroes with wholly within 18 inches of your target hero. So it's a great way to spend those noble deed points around, and putting this on someone like Ushiran, for instance, will let him easily give that point around to a huge swathe of your heroes, not only from his massive base, but also because he is almost certain to be killing at least a few things in combat. The final prayer is Charnel Conviction. This is put on a friendly unit wholly within 18 inches of the priest and gives them a 5-up ward, which is of course brilliant. But again, there is a buffed version. If this is chanted on a 10+, you can instead pick a second target as well, wholly within 18 inches of the first, and they both get that 5-up ward. So you can potentially give 2 big units of ghouls a 5-up ward, or 2 units of knights a 5-up ward, and make your front line much more durable and resilient. In terms of the War Scrolls, we've covered Nagash in all the other death videos, so we won't go into him in much detail here. He is still very good. He can generate those noble deed points for you and bring a really nice aura of +1 attacks. He can also get some nice healing from things like Blessed Feast. He is also a monster, so you could in theory get him strike first with the Royal Menagerie formation, which is quite cool. All in all, he is just great in the Flesh Eater Courts. He's got good output, he's got some great casting value to spam things like Deranged Transformation over and over again, and he even adds yet more recursion to your army from his excellent ability, Supreme Lord of the Undead. Ushiran we also saw in the preview, so again we won't dwell on him too much. He has gone up a very small 10 points to 470, but has otherwise kept his 16 health, 4-up save profile and his 5-up ward. He does now get an extra attack from his scepter, but loses 2 attacks from his talons at max health. But overall, he's definitely better and more reliable in melee, and that extra D3 +3 damage swing he gets is incredibly useful to have. His noble deeds are still spread 24 inches rather than 12, which is great with how quickly he can get up to that cap of 6. He is also a 2-cast wizard, so he can get 2 noble deed points from casting and then just charge in, and he will easily kill 4 enemies to reach that cap very quickly. His spell also still makes an enemy unit hit itself, or hit a unit near it, should I say. You cast it on a 7, and then you pick an enemy model within 18 inches, and you can use one of its own melee weapons to attack another enemy unit in its combat range. So I think, like I said in the preview video, the Chaos Lord on Karkadrak could swing into some Chaos Knights he's accompanying to maybe kill one off. The epicenters are still great and give you some amazing flexibility in how you want the army to play, either being more durable with Defenders of the Realm, or overall quicker and more aggressive with the +1 to run and charge rolls from Crusading Army. So just in general, he's still very good, he's very durable, he's very fighty for 470 points, and being an abhorrent model, he still gets that D3 heal in your hero phase, which is less good than the old 2D3 he had in 3rd, but still a great way to keep him trucking for as long as possible. The next unit is the unnamed hero of the Abhorrent Ghoul King, and this one is on the fearsome Terrorgeist. He's actually dropped a chunk down from 430 points to just 380, so saving you 50 points now, and he still has 16 health with his 4-up save. He is still a 1-cast wizard, and he still has that 6-up death ward. He has also, I think, got a lot better in melee. He now has 5 attacks with the Talons and Fangs, which hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, so 1 extra attack compared to 3rd. His Maw is now 4s and 2s rather than 4s and 3s, and is still 3 2-rend attacks with d6 damage. And then the Terrorgeist Talons are now 6 attacks that are 4s and 2s with 1 rend and 2 damage, instead of 4s and 3s. So all round just more reliable and better. The Gaping Maw returns with 6s to hit, just doing a flat 6 mortal damage from the Fanged Maw, which is unreliable, but with 3 attacks and 4 if you've got Feeding Frenzy up, it will actually happen more often than you think. And then the Rampage is Ferocious Hunger, and this lets you in any combat phase pick an enemy unit and roll a dice, and on a 3+, the Fanged Maw ability goes off on 5s rather than 6s when you attack that hero, so making it really quite likely that at least one of those attacks will just do a flat 6 mortal damage, which is incredibly strong and makes this guy a very, very good anti-hero piece. The Ghoul King on Dragon is next, similar to the one on the Terrorgeist in terms of health, movement and save. He is also 380 points, which is a drop of 40 from third. He has a very solid buff in Monstrous Hunter, which lets friendly non-hero monsters charge even if they've run when they're wholly within 12 inches of him, which does make them very fast and quite easily able to get a turn 1 charge when you need it. It's only for non-hero monsters, so he can't use it himself, but throwing something like a zombie dragon into the enemy lines turn 1 can definitely put a bump in their plans. His Rampage is Draconic Terror, which is again in any combat phase. You can pick an enemy unit he's in combat with and roll a dice, and if the roll is higher than their control score, they can't use commands for the turn. So with a value of 1 or 2 or 3 for most things, you are quite likely to beat it, and being able to turn off all-out attack or all-out defense will massively help this guy survive or just kill as much of the enemy as possible. So that is very good, and overall I think that both this guy and the Terrorgeist variant have gained a lot from the move into 4th. Now we move on to another named hero with the great model of a Grand Justice Gormain. Now I really do love this guy. I think he oozes literally the whole Flesh Eater Court vibe. He is 120 points, so he's not super pricey and has actually dropped 20 points from third. He's not super amazing though. 5 health and a 5-up save is a drop in both health and his save from 3rd edition, and he's lost a point of rend on his gavel, which does also suck. He's now 4 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 3s with D3 damage, which really isn't going to do much. And then his only ability is Delusion of Justice Served, which allows you to pick an enemy unit in your hero phase and roll a dice, and on a 3+ he gets to pick one of 4 effects to occur. Petty Transgression gives your units +1 to wound rolls against the target. Dishonorable Conduct in Battle lets friendly non-monster units charge even if they've run, as long as they end their charge move within half an inch of the target. Grievous Insult to the Court means that if you've got an abhorrent unit in combat with the target, all of your other Flesh Eater Court units get +1 to hit it. And then Regicide means that if the target unit has killed a friendly abhorrent unit in the battle, then your other Flesh Eater Court's units that target it get +1 damage into the enemy unit. So that is actually very good, but it does rely on you losing an abhorrent earlier in the game. Now there are some nice effects here, don't get me wrong, but being on a 3+ means his entire 120 point value is relying on that going off, and if it doesn't, he is just kind of worthless. So I just don't think he's great, to be honest. The buffs are solid, but personally I just like to have a bit more reliability in my lists and the things that the characters that I bring have on their war scroll. The generic abhorrent Gore Warden is next with his amazing new model. He's got a healthy 7 health, although just a 5-up save and 6-up ward to keep him alive. He can do some work in melee with 5 attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, but he has gone up to 160 points from the 150 he was before. He can still fly, which is nice, and he is still a 1-cast wizard, but his main use is actually in mobility with Royal Hunting Party. This allows him in your movement phase to pick up to 2 friendly Crypt Flayers or Morbeg Knights that are wholly within 12 inches of him, and if none of those units, himself included, are in combat, then you can remove all of them from the board and set them up again 9 inches from enemies and all within 12 inches of each other. So he is quite good at just taking a sizable chunk of your force and just utterly moving it to threaten an enemy flank. And if you had something like the Crusading Army delusion up from Usharan and were in range of that, this could net you a cheeky 8-inch charge with up to 3 units, which could make it so you are much more likely to at least get one of them in. We also saw the Marrow Scroll Herald in the preview, and he's still quite unreliable with his main ability of the King's Entreaty only going off on a 3+, but potentially giving you strike first on a unit or making the enemy unit waste command points with Welcome the Disciple. It isn't awful, but he has also gone up from 100 points to 120. So while he's not super pricey, I just don't know if, like with Gormain, there aren't better, more reliable things you could be spending 120 points on that aren't quite so dependent on a 3+ roll to do anything in a turn. Now, he is a courtier, so he does get the noble deed points, and he can proc things like muster guard, so he does have that use as an army buffer, I suppose. I just, again, think he is maybe not amazing for his points overall. Onto a unit that is very good though is the Moorbeggar Knights. Again, fighting for a claim of possibly best cavalry in the game. These guys are 170 points for 3, and they each have a solid 12-inch move, 4 health and a 4-up save. So whilst they aren't super tanky, they are quite resilient for their cost, being around 14 points per health. They also have some really good melee too, with 2 attacks from their lances, which hit on 3s, wound on 4s with 1 rend and 2 damage on the charge, whilst their mounts have a better than normal 3 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and a constant 2 damage. So each knight can potentially be doing 10 damage each. They also do mortals on the charge with their Shrieking Charge, which lets you roll a d3 on a 2+, they do that much mortal damage to an enemy unit that is within 1 inch of them. And then they also have some nice mobility options with Predator's Pounce, letting them retreat and charge, and also suffer no mortal damage when they do retreat. So these guys can cycle charge really well, and then on the charge they can quite reliably put down 7 or 8 4-up save infantry, and then just retreat to go and do it all over again in the next battle round 2. So they are good, they are decently durable, they also have fly as well, which is really handy for getting around screens and chaff. So I think they are just a solid, handy, fast unit for the Flesh Eater Courts to bring. Another new unit is the Crypt Guard. They have dropped to just a 6-up save instead of their old 5-up, but are now only 12 points per model instead of 14. In melee, they gained an attack, but they did drop from 3s and 3s to 4s and 4s, so they are slightly worse overall in combat. They do, however, still get their ward save buffs. When they are in combat range of a hero, both that hero and this unit get a 5-up ward, so they can be a bit trickier to get rid of thanks to that. And then they also still mess around with enemy commands, with Armory of Madness being a very handy reaction. That means after they've fought, they can debuff the enemy so they can't use commands. So they are okay. They are just squishier and less hitty than they were, but are now cheaper and arguably a bit more spammable. And they do still have good interaction with things like your opponent's command points and command abilities. It's also worth noting that technically they do have a higher damage ceiling thanks to having that extra attack. It's just on average they don't do quite as much. So they are still good, I think, and I do think they will likely still see play as a decent generic infantry unit to bring. The Mighty Vargulf Courtier is also a relatively new model. It is a whopping 180 points now, up 20 from 3rd edition, and likewise he has dropped a point of save, going to a 5-up instead of a 4-up, which is annoying. He is very squishy despite having 8 wounds for his cost. Now he did get some extra attacks with 7 instead of 5 from his immense claws. They do only hit on 4s now rather than 3s, but into infantry he is rend 2 instead of rend 1, so that's handy. And then his fangs are still 3s and 2s with 3 damage, and again 3 rend into infantry instead of just 2, so he is quite scary into enemy foot units. And also he can keep himself alive a bit with Victory Feast, which lets him heal d6 at the end of any turn if he's killed any enemy models. So that is really helpful. I just think with only 8 health and that 5-up save and 6-up ward to protect him, there are a lot of things out there that can just kill him in one round of combat, so he will die before he actually gets to use this. But into weaker chaff style infantry, he can be very good for killing them off and then just healing back up to full, going to another chaff unit, killing them off, healing back up to full. So he's good at going into weaker, kind of smaller units of screens and chaff. The generic priest for the Flesh Eater Courts is the Abhorrent Cardinal. He can chant 1 prayer and, like Gormain, has some abysmal melee with no rend, 3 attacks hitting on 4s, wounding on 3s. It's not going to do much. He's dropped 10 points, but again also dropped a point of save, so he is very squishy. He is a rather nice way to generate some extra noble deed points though. He lets you pick a hero within 12 inches of him in any hero phase and roll a d3, and on a 2+, they gain that many points. So this will let you easily generate an extra 2 or 3 noble deed points early on in the game. Which is honestly not bad if you want to max out your deed points as fast as you possibly can, and can be really useful for getting Ushiran up to that cap as soon as possible or anything like that. The fact that it's in any hero phase as well I think is quite nice, because this can allow you to set yourself up well for a following turn to make sure you have enough points to bring some models back or to get up to that 6-point cap for Feeding Frenzy to proc for an upcoming combat phase. So I think this guy is actually okay. I would say personally he's a better pick than Gormain, and having that Priest 1 so he can chant a prayer as well just adds to his value even more. One of my favourite new models is the Decapitator. He's kept his save, still having a 5+, but he has jumped to 110 points from 100. He is still, however, quite scary in melee. He only has 3 attacks which hit on 4s and wound on 3s, but they are 2 rend and a flat 3 damage, which is really nice, and then he can also insta-kill enemy heroes with off with their head. And what this does is that at the end of any turn, if he's caused any damage to an enemy hero, you can roll a dice, and on a 5+, they just flat out die. So even if he's just done 1 damage to a 6 or 7 or 8 health hero, he can still just insta-give them 33% of the time, which is hilariously good if a little bit unreliable, but when it does go off, you are going to absolutely love this guy. He can also use the reaction of Executioner's Entourage. This lets you pick a Serfs unit within his combat range after he's fought and then fight with them immediately. We've seen it before, but this allows him to fight and then a unit of Ghouls or Crypt Guard to fight straight after him, so you can get 2 activations into an enemy before they can swing back into you. The main sort of big frontline heroes and leaders of your army are the Abhorrent Archregent and the Abhorrent Ghoul King. They are very similar, but the Archregent is up first. He's got 6 health and a 5-up save, so they're not exactly tanky for big heroes, and at 190 points, they're not exactly cheap either. He's got the standard 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage melee profile, but with 5 attacks, that is actually more attacks than some other armies, and he is also a 2-cast wizard, which is great. He's also got a really good, interesting spell on his War Scroll, which is Carrion Call. This is cast on a 6+, and you cast it, and then in the following movement phase, the first friendly Flesh Eater Court unit set up can immediately move d6. So if you do this in your hero phase and then bring down a unit in your movement phase, such as say the Gore Warden's Royal Hunting Party, you can then move him d6 inches to get closer to the enemy for a much more reliable charge, possibly even a 3-inch charge to get him into combat, which is really strong. You can also bring models back to your army with Countless Servants. This lets you pick a knight or serf unit wholly within 12 inches in your hero phase and roll a dice, and on a 3+ you can return either a knight or up to 3 serfs. Now this obviously gets the +1 from the formation 2, so on a 3+ he can potentially just add 2 whole Morbeg knights back into a unit, which is over 100 points worth of models. So he is actually really quite efficient for his points despite being 190 because of what he can bring back to your army, and then also having that way to get much easier charges on top of his other casts, because he's a 2-cast wizard, remember, and his decent melee profile. So I think whilst he looks pricey, he is actually really good in my opinion. The Ghoul King is mostly similar. He's got the same stat wheel and melee output, but instead of the recursion, he is more focused on just pure combat. He gets strike first if he's charged thanks to unnatural speed, and then he can also use Code of Honor in any combat phase to pick an enemy hero and give his attacks +1 damage. So he can charge in, strike first, and be doing up to 15 damage into an enemy hero, which is pretty scary. And with Feeding Frenzy and also All Out Attack, he averages about 5 damage into a 3-up save hero, which will actually kill a few armies' heroes, or at the very least seriously injure them. On top of that, he is also a 1-cast wizard, so he can further buff himself up to make him even more killy if you need to. So he can be quite an effective sort of anti-hero torpedo just to throw towards an enemy hero that you think you can reliably kill in one go. Up next, we have the lesser heroes, the courtiers. The Crypt Infernal is the first one. He is the leader of the Crypt Flayers. He's had a hefty bump to 170 points from 140 and has also lost a pip of saving, going down to 5. His melee attacks are still 4s and 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, so they're okay, and he still has his ranged attacks with 4 death screeches, which are again the same 4s and 3s with 2 rend and d3 damage. Now the buff he brings is directly for the flayers, and it means that if he kills any models with his death screech, then you get +1 to the damage of the Crypt Flayer's ranged weapons. So he basically helps them screech at the enemy a little bit louder. It can absolutely add some ranged punch to your lists for sure, but it can be quite risky relying on those 4 death screech attacks. They will on average kill off a couple of 4-up save infantry, but hitting on 4s is never the most reliable thing, and so I think for 170 points, it's again sort of iffy as to whether he's worth bringing, especially since I don't think Crypt Flayers are that great by themselves either. The Crypt Haunter Courtier is still the same 140 points he was before, but he has also lost a save going to 5-up. However, his Bone Club and Talons are still quite scary, with 5 attacks that only hit on 4s, but they wound on 3s with 2 rend and a flat 3 damage, so that's fairly nice. He also, unlike other courtiers, can heal in your hero phase with Noble Blood, which keeps his 6 health going a bit longer, and then he has a reaction in Knightly Exemplar, which lets him pick a Crypt Horrors unit to fight straight after him, and when they do, they get +1 to hit, which is actually really nice on them because they've got a base 4-up to hit, so it does add a lot to their output. So I prefer this guy to the Crypt Infernal. I think he's a bit cheaper, he is a bit slower, but he's still got a solid 7-inch move, and he makes Crypt Horrors much scarier in melee too. As I said, the units they lead are somewhat similar to their heroes. The Crypt Flayers come in a unit of 3 with 4 health and the same 5-up save and 12-inch move. They've got 4 attacks in melee that hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 1 rend and 1 damage, and then as mentioned their ranged attack is the Death Scream, which is 4 shots each. They are 10-inch range, they hit on 4s, wound on 3s with 2 rend and 1 damage, and of course they can go up to 2 damage with the Crypt Infernal's buff. So that isn't terrible, and if the buff does go off, that could net you around 3 dead Chaos Warriors in a shooting phase before you charge in, so that will make a subsequent combat phase much easier. They do also have a reasonably cool ability where they can pick up a hero that can't fly and use their Escort Courier move to move that hero around the board. So they can make their 12-inch move and bring that hero along with them, who can then be set up 3 inches from enemies. So it can help you get a slower hero around the board a bit more easily and potentially into combat a bit more easily, rather than relying on what could be a more difficult charge roll. But for 170 points again, I think Morbeg Knights kind of just do what they do, but better. Now, Crypt Horrors, much like the Crypt Haunter, are just overall a bit better. They are 4 health with a 5-up save and the same decent 7-inch move as the Haunter. They can also heal D3 in your hero phase, which is great on a 4 health unit. They are 150 points, so 50 points each, and they not only get +1 rend when they are wholly within 12 inches of a courtier or abhorrent, but like we saw just a moment ago with the Haunter, they can get +1 to hit in that combo, so their clubs can potentially be 4 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 3s with 1 rend, 2 damage, and auto wounding on crits, which is quite a solid little profile, and it does make them a surprisingly durable anvil that can actually hit back quite hard. The standard ghouls are up next. These guys are just your horde. A minimum unit costs you 170, but it is 20 strong. So that is 20 wounds with a 6-up save, 6-up ward, throwing out 40 attacks that hit and wound on 4s with no rend and 1 damage, but they do auto wound on crits. So you can reliably get 6 or 7 auto wounds from the whole unit. They also get +1 rend when they are wholly within 12 inches of a courtier or abhorrent, so that can really add to their output. the unit can do around 9 damage to a 4-up save enemy, so putting quite a big dent into an enemy monster just through weight of dice. And then of course in the formation, you could be getting a huge amount of damage because you can activate 2 of these units before the enemy can, so they have a lot of potential, not in quality, but just in sheer quantity. The unmounted version of the Dragon and Terrorgeist are also here, both with 14 health and a 4-up save. We saw the Dragon in the preview, but at 290 points you get the same ranged and melee attacks, just without the abhorrence attacks on top. He can deep strike in with Loathsome Descent, and he has that cool little move in the combat phase with Soaring Terror as his rampage, so he can do a bit of extra mortal damage and also potentially fly over a unit to tag some other units behind your charge target to either disrupt the enemy lines or tag a wizard that was trying to hide from you or something. So he can be a quite nice little tech piece as well. The Terrorgeist, on the other hand, is 10 points cheaper at 280. He still has that terrifying Gaping Maw ability for the potential 6 mortal damage, but his ability is Death Shriek. Now this is actually also the name of his ranged attack with 1 shot that hits on 4s, wounds on 2s with 2 rend and d6 damage, but the Rampage version lets you pick an enemy unit and roll a dice for each model in the unit, and on a 6 you do a mortal damage, which is nice. The bonus is that if you do 3 or more damage to a unit, they also get -1 to their hit rolls for the turn. So against a unit of 20, this should on average get you to that 3 damage, so into bigger enemy units this can be a nice way to kill off a few and still debuff them in the following combat phase. So this is quite a good rampage, especially into those bigger sort of 20 strong enemy blobs. The old warband of the Royal Beast Slayers also returns. It's been bumped up to 120 points and they are still 1 health with a 6-up save, so very squishy. Their weapons have all been combined to now just being Beast Flayer's weapons, which are 3 attacks on 4s and 4s with no rend and 1 damage, but they do gain 1 rend against beasts and monsters, so that is obviously their main target. They can also still roll a d3 and do mortal damage on a 2+ in the combat phase, but they do get +1 damage on that to monsters or beasts, so either 3 or 4 damage into those units. And then their Hunter's Instincts passive lets them actually reduce the damage from monsters and beasts by 1 while they're in combat with these guys, which is very strong, and not only protects these guys but also anything else in your army that might be in combat with that monster. It also means that monsters can't use rampage abilities, so this is genuinely a very strong passive. It makes monsters much less scary into these guys and into the rest of your army, so they could be worth it if the enemy has a load of monsters or there are 1 or 2 key scary monsters you know might make an appearance that you want to debuff as much as possible. They are just still very squishy, and it's likely that this unit will die even with that -1 damage from most monsters' attacks. Finally, we get to the manifestations. We've got Corpsemare Stampede, Cadaverous Barricade, and the Chalice of Usharan. The Stampede is summoned on a 7+ and is set up wholly within 9 inches of the caster, and what it does is let you pick 3 enemy units that it moves over in the movement phase and roll a d3 for each, and on a 2+ you do that much mortal damage. So with a 12-inch move, it can quite reliably go over at least 1 or 2 enemy units and do some damage to them. It does also have 10 attacks, but it hits on 5s with no rend, so it isn't going to do much. But again, it's a little bit of extra chip damage. The main use of it though is that trampled underfoot ability. The Cadaverous Barricade is cast on 5. This one is set up within 18 inches of the caster. It's got 10 health and a 4-up save, and this prevents enemy units from running or retreating when they are in combat range of it. They also have to half their movement when they're in combat range of it. So it's basically a way to lock down a part of the board and stop fast moving units from getting up and threatening your lines before you're ready for them, or alternatively making already slow moving units like zombies essentially just have to spend a turn or 2 doing nothing but moving incredibly slowly until this thing is either destroyed or they manage to get out of its combat range. The Chalice of Usharan is cast on a 6. This one is set up wholly within 12 inches of the caster. It only has 6 health and a 6-up save, so it's very easy to get rid of. But what it does is it gains blood points whenever an enemy or friendly model is killed within 12 inches of it. and the cap is 6 blood points, but you can at the end of any turn pick a friendly unit wholly within 18 inches of this and give that unit a bonus to its command value based on how many blood points you spend. So this is essentially a way to very quickly give a unit up to 6 extra control. So if you need to grab or flip an objective, this can be a fantastic way to just do it quickly and reliably to get what you need. So I don't think it's bad from that perspective. The issue is that it can't move, so it might actually not be able to impact the objective that you need it to. And also it being so squishy, it can very easily be dealt with before it can really have an impact on the game if your opponent knows what it does. The final piece of the Flesh Eater Court puzzle is the Charnel Throne. This has got 10 health and a 4-up save, and this is your terrain piece. You can put an infantry hero on it to act as its steward, and then while your hero is the steward of it, they can't move, but all ranges are measured from the terrain piece, and then they get the ruler of all they survey rule, which grants your steward D3 noble deed points in each of your hero phases. So this can be a nice way to get up to that 6 deed point cap quickly, and then have it spread out in a much bigger bubble thanks to the terrain piece. Now let's be honest, it's not amazing because quite often you just want your hero moving up and getting into combat to generate those points, but for a hero that you may want to keep back to cast or not want in melee, this could be a reliable way to keep those 6 noble deed points up, and if you put this terrain piece nearer to a particular objective you want to keep hold of, it could be a good way to keep it defended as well as possible, because any units near it that will be fighting over it will be almost guaranteed to have Feeding Frenzy up for most of the time. Overall, I would say the Flesh Eater Courts do seem to have caught a bit of a nerf in the durability department. A lot of saves have dropped, but on the flip side, they do have a good selection of spells and prayers. Their manifestations are kind of iffy in my opinion, and generally I do think they lack a bit of rend in their melee, but where they are very strong is in sheer weight of dice and in weight of bodies. They can bring back so many bodies over the game and just drown the enemy in a frenzy of claws and teeth and dice. And then on top of that, the heroes, especially the bigger sort of heroes, are quite good too, with things like your abhorrence and Ushiran himself being very scary in melee, and also very good at playing around with some movement tricks to get your units up the board and into combat as quick as possible. So I think they do have a lot going for them. They do seem weak in some ways, but they have got a few very strong war scrolls, and like I said, the Morbeg Knights I think are fantastic for their price. But as always, what do you make of the Flesh Eater Courts? And which of the formations do you think is the best? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later guys.